Welcome to Terrifying Tales, the channel dedicated to bringing you original horror stories. Please support the channel by hitting the like button or leaving a comment, and please consider subscribing to the channel by hitting the subscribe button on the bottom right hand corner of the screen. The Bank. The tiny branch of Northford National Bank sat on Main Street, Exeter, a little 4-block dirt patch just south of Beamfield. Many times Northford National considered closing the branch on the grounds the cost outweighed the profit. But each time, the small but loud small client base complained enough to stay the executioner's hand. Northford's compromise this time around was to open the branch on Wednesdays and Fridays only. It was on this particular Friday morning the branch found itself a hive of activity compared to normal, with 2 customers inside. Truth be told, the building was too large for its purpose. The carpet stretched the length of the building, unchanged since the branch opened 35 years earlier. A few metal posts separated by yellowing faded rope angled their way toward the telecounter at the back. Betsy Lamb sat behind the telescreen alone. Betsy passed for attractive in such a small town, but too much makeup covering the raccoon eyes of lack of sleep. She was a woman desperately keeping age at bay, but losing to father time. Howard Mitchell sat alone in the manager's office, waiting the shift out behind a game of solitaire on his computer screen, the smoked glass surrounding his office keeping his secrets. Margaret Thompson pushed her glasses up from the end of her nose, desperately trying to unblur the deposit slip she was filling out at the stand on the far wall. Her arthritic fingers refusing to cooperate with the pen attached to the stand by a small chain. Chris Jordan tapped his foot impatiently as he waited for Margaret to leave. He had very important work scheduled for the day, and every minute counted if he wanted to get it finished. Betsy's eyes were drawn to the front door as the man entered. He was unremarkable looking. Betsy's heart fluttered as she eyed the man. She bit her lip as she found herself equal parts excited and nervous. A cap covered the top half of his face as he kept his head down. One could certainly classify the man's clothing as casual, but Betsy knew the gold watch on his wrist signified wealth. The man ambled to the centre of the bank without raising his head. "Can I help you, sir?" Betsy said. The man answered without raising his head. "I'm here for an appointment. I'm just a little early." The man lifted his wrist to check the time. Betsy didn't think Howard had any appointments scheduled for the day, but who knew what he did in that office? "Is Howard expecting you?" "Sorry," the man said. "It's not that kind of appointment." The man let his wrist drop, and a grin spread beneath the shadow of the peak of his cap. It sent a shiver rolling up Betsy's spine. The front door of the bank opened again. "Everybody on the ground, now!" "What's going on out here?" Howard came out of his office. The butt of the shotgun dropped him to the floor. "I said on the ground!" The robber had his face covered by a bandana. He pointed the shotgun at Betsy. "Get out from behind there now, or I'll paint the fucking wall with your brains." Betsy struggled to make her body move. She stumbled as she used the counter to support her shaking body out from behind the teller's desk. Chris had dropped to the floor as soon as he heard the shot. His eyes pleaded with Margaret to join him. But Margaret's age made it a difficult task. It certainly didn't help that she also held a stubborn constitution. The robber sent another shot into the ceiling. "I said on the ground!" The man in the cap stood firm in the centre of the room. The robber raised the man's head with the barrel of the shotgun. Something funny? On the ground. I won't ask you again. The grin on the man's face held firm. I'm just happy everything is running on time. But I am sorry. To stay on schedule, I won't be getting on the ground. Blood sprayed as the cap flew toward the front door of the bank. Betsy screamed as the man in the cap flopped to the floor, minus most of his head. We'll do whatever you want, just don't kill anyone else, Howard said. Chris dragged Margaret's frail body to the floor beside his own. The robber set his sights on Howard. Oh, I know you'll do what I want. Howard groaned in pain as the robber kicked him. I want what's in the safe. Safe? Howard said. We don't have one. The robber kicked him again. Don't fucking lie to me. I'm not, Howard said. We only open 2 days a week. We only keep what's in the teller drawer. Any withdrawal over $1,000 has to be organised in advance by the customers. The robber kicked Howard again. His eyes scanned the inside of the building. It dawned on him in that moment that Howard was telling the truth. The open plan revealed there was no safe. You! He pointed the shotgun at Betsy. Empty the drawer into a bag and bring it to me. Betsy had shut down. Her shivering body leaned on the front of the teller desk, her eyes glued to the body of the man in the cap. Hey! The robber aimed the shotgun at Howard's face. Do what I said, or your boss is going to have to explain to the family why he doesn't have a head anymore. Betsy's eyes remained on the body, but the robber's words had broken through. Okay, she said. She wobbled to her feet. The man in the cap sat up. The parts of his head that had been missing were back. You certainly live up to your reputation, David. Huh? The robber's mind scrambled as his own name registered. Do I know you? The man picked himself up from the ground. He ambled toward the front door and picked up his cap. He tapped the inside of it to bend it back into shape. Specks of blood rained on the carpet from the peak. No, you don't. But I know you. The man returned the cap to his head. The robber found his composure. Well, now you've let my name slip. You've just killed everyone in this bank today. Have I? The smile remained firmly in place beneath the shadow of the peak of the cap. Yeah, you have. I just wanted you to know that. Howard lifted his hands to shield his face as the barrel levelled in front of him. Margaret, being too old to be nervous, was the only one who knew for sure that the man in the cap moved without moving. Margaret hadn't blinked, yet the man in the cap disappeared from the centre of the bank and was now beside David. David Simpson, the man said. He placed his hand on David's shoulder. The shotgun tumbled from David's grip to the carpet below. The robber tried to move, but other than the fingers gripping his shoulder, his entire body was numb. All of your life, you've killed, robbed, stolen. Your motivations were never financial. You drew your enjoyment by inflicting pain on others. The man's eyes closed beneath the peak of his cap. David found his mind transported to his childhood home. You only seem to have one regret in your entire life, David. You stood back and watched while your drunken father mercilessly beat your younger brother night after night. He begged you to save him. He begged you for help, David. You sat back and watched, grateful it was him and not you. But you were guilt-riddled with that nonetheless. David screamed as countless beatings flashed through his brain, the bank filled with the sounds of splintered bones as the damage of 100 beatings thundered his body all at once. Blood sprayed from David's mouth. Black bruises covered his face and body. His skin ripped, blood poured to the carpet. A final blow caved David's skull, and his lifeless corpse dropped to the ground. Betsy screamed at the twisted, bloody mess that had been a healthy man seconds earlier. Howard pulled himself to his hands and knees and backed away from David's corpse. Thank you, young man." The man in the cap knelt down and placed his hand on Howard's shoulder. Howard Mitchell. The bank vanished in front of Howard's eyes. "I see only one guilty act that eats at you, but it's a big one." The smell of petrol filled Howard's nostrils. Screams filled his ears. Howard knew where he was. The world was upside down. Blood ran down his face where the shattered windshield glass had cut it. A boozy fog filled his body. Howard was drunk the night he drove his friends home from the party. He lost control and crashed. The heat of the flames kissed his body as the screams of his friends intensified. Howard knew the story. He would get out of the car and leave his friends to burn to death. Howard pulled at the belt buckle by his waist. Huh? This was all wrong. Not how it went. The buckle refused to open. The others in the bank watched as Howard's body caught alight before their eyes, right there on the bank floor. Howard writhed in agony as his flesh boiled. He let out a final agonising scream as his scorched body slumped to the floor. The man in the cap appeared beside the trembling Betsy. Betsy Lamb. An oldie but a goodie. As the man's fingers dug into her shoulder, Betsy found herself in her old classroom. She was with her friends standing around one desk. The girl sitting at the desk had her head down. Tears were falling onto the wooden desktop. The girl's name was Anna Reese, a heavy-set girl. School was a nightmare for poor Anna. All of the other girls picked on her mercilessly for her weight. Poor Anna Reese. You feel responsible for what happened to her, don't you, Betsy? Anna ran screaming from the classroom. There's a good reason for that, Betsy, and you know it. Betsy found herself in the bedroom of Anna Reese. Time had passed. There was a frail girl lying motionless in the bed. Betsy wasn't familiar with what she was looking at. Seeming to sense her failure to understand, the man's voice echoed in her mind. This is what happened to poor Anna, Betsy. But you know what happened to her. That's why you feel guilty. But I wanted you to see what you did. All those years of bullying destroyed Anna. Always picking on her weight. She starved herself to death. Chris turned his head away from the bank counter as Betsy's body shriveled away. Her skin shriveled and wrinkled, muscle and fat rotted. Her face sunk inwards and her eyes burst. Betsy's body crumpled to dust beneath the man's fingers. The man's steps were soft on the carpet as he walked toward Chris and Margaret. Margaret looked up at the man's smiling face, his eyes fixed firmly on hers. She gave a whimper as he knelt down beside her. Her eyes grew wide as her heart gave out. Not so fast, the man said. His fingers found her shoulder. The pain in Margaret's chest eased. You haven't made me smile yet, Margaret. Show me your guilt. Margaret found herself in the living room of her small home. The gentle rays of the sun filtered through the window. Her husband Stephen sat in the lounge chair motionless, the dinner tray resting on his lap. You didn't feel guilty until this very moment, did you, Margaret? She knew what the man meant. Sick of looking after her husband as age took his mobility and his faculties, she poisoned his food. It wasn't until the deed was done and she was able to see the result of her handiwork, that she knew she'd done the wrong thing. You got away with it, didn't you, Margaret? The police mistook your tears of guilt for tears of sadness. Stephen was frail. The police figured it was a miracle he lived as long as he did. They never ordered a post-mortem. You got away with murder, but that guilt eats away, more than anyone else's here today. Chris heard Margaret choking beside him on the bank floor. He turned his head and saw the blood. Margaret clutched at her stomach. Steam rose as her insides melted away. Just one left. The man turned to Chris. He placed his fingers down on Chris's shoulder. Chris Jordan. The smile left the man's face. Interesting. I see your life, Chris, and you regret none of it. In fact, the closest thing you have to a regret is that you're stuck here with me and I'm keeping you away from important work. You don't fear me at all. The man pulled his hand away from Chris's shoulder. The smile returned to his face. Don't let me keep you, Chris. Go do your work. Apparently you'll regret it if you don't. Chris looked up at the man's smiling face. Who are you? I have many names. I suppose it depends on which literature you favour. The man lifted the peak of his cap away from his face, revealing a pair of deep red eyes. Chris looked around at all of the bodies on the floor of the bank. Why are you letting me go? A fair question. The man replaced the cap to cover his eyes. People are so preoccupied with the ideas of right and wrong, good and evil. I don't particularly care about any of that. I've always been fascinated with the ideas of guilt and regret. I'm letting you go, Chris, because you're unique. I look through your entire life. There are deeds that many would classify as good and bad, all hiding there. But you regret nothing. You hold no guilt, no remorse in your soul. As I said, you would regret not going to do your work, but it would seem unsporting for me to hold that against you, seeing as that's my fault. The man motioned toward the front door of the bank. Off you go. Chris made straight for the door. He felt the man's eyes on his back the whole way, but he didn't dare turn back. The quick trip home passed in a blur. Chris stumbled along the driveway past his house and straight to the workshop in the shed out back. The man's words were played in his head. Go do your work. Apparently you'll regret it if you don't. Chris fumbled with the keys as he pulled them from his pocket. He opened the lock and pulled the heavy door just enough to squeeze inside. Chris checked the driveway nervously, expecting to see the smiling man. But he was alone. He pulled the door closed. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The only light in the room came from a small window close to the roof. Dust danced through the small line of filtered sunlight. Chris stumbled to his workbench. He closed his eyes and ran his hand through his hair. Do I really bear no guilt for anything in my life? He wondered. Chris's fingers found the handle of the knife on top of the workbench. He turned toward the terrified eyes of the woman tied to the chair in the centre of the room. She mumbled from behind the gag in her mouth. Sorry I kept you waiting, Chris said. The gag ate the woman's muffled screams as Chris approached. I had the craziest trip to the bank. I'll tell you about it while we work. If you like what you heard, please like and share the video. And please subscribe to the channel. Remember, the dark plays tricks with our mind, but sometimes it isn't a trick. Sometimes there really is something there.